Okay, that's wonderful. Good to hear. As you see, I'll be speaking about utopia today, utopia in the modern world. Utopia is a term that should be familiar to most people in your part of the world, where utopia is a long tradition. I think of course, the work of Mahatma Gandhi. I think of intentional utopian communities. One of the which I have been studying is Auroville, which is now mired in some controversy in India, but a very interesting model for many Western intentional utopian communities. With that said, I'm going to focus my attention on the West, which I know best, and we'll begin with a quote from Oscar Wilde, which you will see in the next slide, who offers a sense of the enthusiasm that many Western thinkers, including this great playwright and writer, have felt about utopia. He concludes famously that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing better countries set sail. Progress for Wilde is the realization of utopia. Wilde is not alone in this feeling of enthusiasm for how it is that humanity very much needs utopia. Now, in this talk, I'm going to discuss what utopia means, why it is significant, what we can learn from a focus on utopian ideas, a bit about the classical tradition in utopia in the Western world, and shifting, most importantly, to new developments in utopia. I mean, one of the remarkable things is that in this deeply troubled world, utopia as a concept, as something to be both intellectually and emotionally attached to, has experienced a profound resurgence. And I want to understand just what the basis of that resurgence is, whether it might offer us ideas for a better world, and to know whether, in fact, utopia as a guide to the future has a future itself. Utopia as a concept is contradictory. Let's have the next slide, please. Next slide after this. We're on the title slide. Do I have control over this, or do you? Let's go to what is utopia. The third slide. That's great.
Can you make the slide full view, whosoever is controlling?
Okay.
Yes,
good.
sir. I'm doing that.
We're doing fine. Utopia is one of those interesting ideas that is full of contradiction, in part because it means two, what some consider very different things. It comes from the Greek topos, meaning a space or place, and you can mean either a good place, you meaning in Greek better, or you meaning negative, no place. So utopia has followed what amounts to two paths, both the good place, the better place than the one we are living in today, the search for a better future, but also the place of no place. It is, in fact, nowhere, and that can imply a kind of negativity. The search for utopia is, in this view, hopeless, or it can mean something with an interesting technological twist. Those who favor, for example, exploring virtual reality see utopia as the place of no physical place, but a utopia of virtual space. So it's important to keep in mind these contradictory notions as we move on to the next slide. And here we have the founding figure in the concept of utopia in the West, Thomas More. So here we have a concept that in English is over now 500 years old. More was a very interesting character, lived in an interesting time. He was an advisor to King Henry VIII, gave him some bad advice, and after writing Utopia, found himself brought to trial and beheaded. So an enormously interesting life, and he left with us the model for utopia as we know it in the West. Next slide. More has us in his book, Utopia, going off to an island somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, which becomes a profoundly better place. It is a place of community, of cooperation, of sharing, a place that has rid itself of most, but not all, of the deficiencies of Western society in the 16th century. Interestingly enough, utopia as island comes up again and again and again over the next 5 centuries. Indeed, I think it's interesting if we want to distinguish utopia from the fairy tale, one can say that in the fairy tale, following the playwright Stephen Sondheim, fairy tales go into the woods, whereas utopias involve sailing off to the perfect island, and the island imagery comes up again and again and again. But let's examine a bit of the significance of More's Utopia before moving on. Next slide. It is interesting that publishing in 1516, More's Utopia came at the start of the massive wave of Western imperialism. This is the age of expansion, of finding new worlds. So it is no coincidence that More would offer us a new world, but his new world involved the hope that the West might start over again, that it might begin again as a nonviolent, communitarian, indeed socialist world that caught the attention of Marx 4 centuries later, in that Marx recognized that Thomas More contributed a sense of a kind of primitive socialism to social thought, that its dependency on and its support for communal ownership and fundamental rights mattered greatly for future society. Now, the question is, why is utopia a popular concept today? Let's consider the next slide. I'm writing a book about utopia. There are 2 motivations that drive me. When we look at the world today, we see many fundamental challenges, and I identify 4 of the most significant. In the West, we have this image in the Bible of the Western Bible of the last book, the book of the Apocalypse, in which the 4 horsemen of evil are saddling up and moving to destroy the world. Well, in a sense, we have 4 horsemen saddling up today, only I would identify them as the global pandemics we are experiencing, massive climate change, the threat of nuclear war that we have seen reawakened in the Ukraine conflict, and finally, the deepening of global social inequality. So those are the challenges we're facing, and that drive me to look to the history of utopia as perhaps a way to find solutions to these fundamental problems. A second reason is the arrival, next slide please, of the latest turn in the world of social media, now called Web 3.0, the arrival of the metaverse. And here we see Mr. Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, which has gone as far as to rename the company. It is now Meta, after the renewed and reformed vision of Facebook Meta as a metaverse company, a company that will move from social media via Web 3.0 technologies like Oculus glasses, artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunications, wireless systems, to create a living three-dimensional virtual reality that Facebook Meta hopes to dominate and deliver a utopia, if not in the real world, then in a virtual world. Next slide, please. This is what Zuckerberg, in perhaps his strongest language, has to say about his commitment to the metaverse, which, by the way, involves investments of billions of dollars, the transfer of tens of thousands of his employees from a focus on social media, Web 2.0, to the metaverse. He says that a lot of people think that the metaverse is about a place, but one definition of this is it's about a time when basically immersive digital worlds become the primary way that we live our lives and spend our time. Now, I'd like to concentrate on that last line. It's fairly extraordinary. He believes that the metaverse will be the primary way that we live our lives and spend our time, living, working, playing, you name it. It will be done through avatars living in a virtual world, what he hopes to be a utopian world. Next slide. So the question arises about the metaverse. Yes, it's a virtual world. It is, in a sense, utopian in that it is the place of no place that Meta hopes to perfect. But really, is it an escape from the four problems and others that the world is facing? Or does it provide a genuine solution? And even more significantly, among those who are debating policy around the metaverse, will it be centralized in the power of Facebook Meta, the power of Mark Zuckerberg, or will it be genuinely decentralized? Will it provide and empower individuals to gain greater control, greater purchase over their lives? Now let's shift from the reasons why there's growing interest in utopia to look at a kind of an overview of utopia in the present world. Next slide. Now, one of the reasons that I'm writing a book, which, as you can see, has the tentative title, and I'll explain why, of The Education of Desire, Utopia in the Age of the Multiverse. One of the reasons I'm pursuing this is that there's been an upsurge in new patterns in the world of utopia, that while Thomas More's themes have dominated for 500 years, over 5 centuries, there are new themes that I plan to highlight in my writing that I will highlight here. Themes that have been ignored in most studies of even contemporary research on utopia, because they're still caught up in many of the ideas of More and classical utopia. These themes include, and I will explain what they mean in a few minutes, include eco-socialism, the merging of green and red, ecological socialism, a neo-colonial, a post-colonial theme at war with neo-colonialism, what we call Afro-futurism, very prominent in North America. Feminist utopias have taken on great significance, especially on the recognition that most utopias in classical thinking are patriarchal. And then finally, there is the utopia of technology, which I call variously anarcho-utopia, where big tech takes control through the metaverse and empowers people. We might also call it cyber-utopia. So this is a general view of where utopian studies, in my view, ought to go and what I hope to highlight in my forthcoming book. So next slide. The question, of course, arises is why bother studying utopia? What can it accomplish? Next slide, please.
Asif.
Thank you. I identify 4 important contributions that utopia can make to contemporary thinking. The first and most obvious is that it can provide ideas for a better world. And I suggest here recent utopian books that are doing that. Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. Interestingly, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book. He's a famous science fiction writer. And I should say as an aside, much of the best thinking about utopia comes from fiction and comes from science fiction. Kim Stanley Robinson studied with the Marxist Frederick Jameson and writes in a kind of eco-socialist mode. His novel, his most famous, The Ministry for the Future, in fact, begins in India, where there have been tens of millions of people who have died from, at some future point, from excessive heat. They have reached what is the danger point, the point beyond which one cannot survive, what's known as wet bulb conditions. And the world focuses on India, which independently directs its Air Force to launch protective metal that surrounds the Earth and reflects sunlight, thereby cooling the world's temperature, buying the world another 10 more years, during which the world creates a ministry for the future that helps solve the world's climate change problems. But the book, though science fiction, is full of interesting ideas about climate change, as is Lauren Groff's Arcadia, which is full of ideas about intentional communities, how to build the communal societies of the future. And the book, The Feminist Utopia Project, which asks 57 leading women in the world about how they would construct a feminist utopia. So it's clearly the case that these and other books can provide at least ideas to debate about creating a better world. Now, in addition, and let's look at the next slide, there are books that focus on what I call, what actually I took from the work of the great Marxist historian Edward P. Thompson, who wrote The Making of the English Working Class, what he called the education of desire. Focusing on utopia is not simply an intellectual task. It is not just an analytical one. It is indeed an emotional task as well. That is, a utopia can provide people with a sense of the desire for a better future. And Christian Kumar and Frederick Jameson have talked about the need to educate people to want a better future, to the point that they will devote their lives to trying to accomplish it. So it's not just about ideas, it's also about emotions, to create the kind of character that will want a future and not despair of what it is likely to become. Next slide. Thirdly, utopia can challenge us as scholars especially to move beyond the presentism of so much academic research. Understandably, we scholars tend to focus on what is. We gathered empirical data on what is, and we tend to neglect, though of course not entirely, neglect the future, neglect looking into the crystal ball as to what the world may become. And Ruth Levitas, a sociologist, in fact, who has written two very important books that examine how social scientists need to reorient themselves, and through utopian studies can reorient themselves to thinking more significantly and substantially about the future. And the final reason for, final thing that utopia can accomplish, next slide. Here it can show the technology, while helpful in building a future, a guide to the many different kinds of utopia. It's not central to utopia. It's my view that the metaverse, like most earlier communication technologies, beginning with the telegraph, are more evidence of a digital sublime than a genuine pathway to a realizable future. And here we have two books that focus on the theme of using technology, but only as an instrument and not as an endpoint. The metaverse is not a utopia. That in fact, any utopia will be socially constructed, and it will involve our effective dealing with one another and with our biological environment. Next slide. Now, before I get to the key themes in contemporary utopian studies, I want to say something about the classical utopian themes. Mainly in the West, I think it's very important to understand, especially these days, as people looked at the United States and seeing it perhaps retreating into a near religious form of governance. The recent leaking of a Supreme Court opinion that would ban abortions for women take us back to an earlier religious time. And it's important to understand that America was founded as a religious utopia. People leaving Britain to find religious freedom and then impose their religious ideas on the rest of the population. Now, there have been significant utopian works in the American tradition. I'll only highlight one that is a very useful piece of literature, if only because of its impact. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward in 1888. Bellamy wrote from Boston, and he wrote in that year to imagine what the world in the year 2000 would bring about. And it turned out to be a kind of communal socialist utopia. This book lives on. In fact, Coretta Scott King, who would become the wife of the great civil rights leader Martin Luther King, when she was beginning to date King, let's go back, please, the previous slide. Beginning to see Martin Luther King, she gave him a copy of Bellamy's book, which King appreciated and in fact responded that he in fact saw the world in much more socialist and capitalist terms, and that Bellamy's utopia might be a guiding point for his future. There have been a number of and various kinds of classical utopian treatments in Britain, many of which are responses to the Industrial Revolution. William Morris's News from Nowhere gave us the vision of the pastoral utopia, the agricultural farm utopia where we will retreat to a quieter, more sedate world in rural England. Robert Owen, in founding Owenite communities in Britain and throughout the United States, believed that the heavy manufacturing of the Industrial Revolution must give way to worker-controlled communities that, yes, believed in industry, but in small industry. And finally, there was Ebenezer Howard, who I've written about in my book on smart cities, gave birth to the whole Garden City movement, writing in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Howard believed in a kind of suburban middle ground between the city and the country. The Garden City would serve as the utopia. The question arises as classical utopian studies developed. We'll take the next slide, about whether Marx was a utopian. He, in fact, drew some significance from Thomas More's own work and knew it well, but he attacked what he called utopian socialism for lacking a sense of class struggle, for its failure to resist big industry, and for believing that we needed to attack capitalism and not retreat into what might be better places, but still within capitalism. Nevertheless, while he critiqued utopian socialism, he also offered a vision of communism as utopian. And one might say that Marx was indeed a utopian. After all, what better utopian statement can one find than from each according to their ability, to each according to their need? Now, I'll just conclude this detour into Marx by simply pointing out that utopia has had a significant place, certainly in the development of Western Marxism. It was Ernst Bloch who wrote The Principle of Hope, a 3-volume collection of his work on utopia. Bloch was a German Marxist. Lukács wrote about utopia. So did Frankfurt School theorists like Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno wrote on utopia, as did Frederick Jameson, who continued to write about utopia, and again has had an influence on many utopian writers. Now let's take the next slide. Why do we need to depart from classical utopian visions? For many people observing utopia in this classical tradition, the good society is mainly a society for Western white men. That utopia, for all of its beneficence, is filled with imperialism, with sexism, with racism. Thomas More abolished slavery on his island for captured Black people, but slavery still existed for those who would be imprisoned for crimes. They would be committed to be enslaved to masters. So imperialism, sexism, and racism are fully a part of utopians everywhere, and especially in the West. There are exceptions. One needs to point to a tradition of feminist utopia as early as in the work of Christine de Pizan, who wrote in 1405, Mary Wollstonecraft, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, all had visions of feminist utopias, but they are the exceptions. Next slide. There are other exceptions, most enlightening in a new book by Graeber and Wengrow called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. There is now documentation about the influence of American indigenous peoples, utopian communities, on European Enlightenment thinkers, like, for example, Voltaire and others. Interestingly, reversing the notion that the Enlightenment was born in Western Europe. In fact, what they point out is that it may have been born among indigenous people of North America. And then there, of course, some classical work on resistance among African Americans, the so-called African American Enlightenment offered to us in Martin Delaney's book, Black Nationalism. But these are exceptions. Classical utopia is full of some of the same problems that we have faced in the West, certainly, for many, many years. Next slide. I'd like now to move and ultimately conclude the talk by talking about utopia today. What's new? There's been a remarkable upsurge, as I've said, in utopian thinking. The first fundamental theme is the theme of eco or ecological socialism, which brings together the green movement with the socialist movement. And here we have three books that are new major examples, both in fiction and nonfiction, of how the world can create both community and a world of ecological, environmental stability for the next many years. Next slide. There's also been an upsurge in feminist utopian writing, again, both in fiction and nonfiction. These imagine a future world run by women, as in the female man. They imagine a genderless world where the great science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin writes about the elimination of gender as a category of any consequence in the world. And most recently, Lauren Groff in the novel The Matrix reimagines the past in a convent in France in the 13th century run by women, how women can create a utopia in a small community. So eco-socialism, feminist utopias. Let's skip the next slide and go on to the next the one after that on post-colonialism. There are now utopian visions of a world beyond colonialism. And in the West, and especially in the United States, this has been inspired by the movement called Afro-futurism. This is an incredible development that has exploded on the scene of art, culture, film, both popular and elite culture, a massive number of books out, including the ones on this slide. What mainly Black writers, artists have done is they have reimagined both the past, the what if, for example, slavery did not happen, and they've reimagined the future where African Americans, in a sense, are the leaders of the world. Much of this is bound up with technology, an appreciation of technology, including communication technology, that becomes the tool for African Americans and other post-colonial peoples to seize control over the world and make it better. Next slide. We've seen this perhaps most evident in Hollywood, where the award-winning film Black Panther was an enormous worldwide success from the United States to China. The film Black Panther imagined a future world where Africa, based on its discovery of vital metals for the development of technology, becomes the center of the world, creating a utopia that ultimately will save the world. Next slide. Afro-futurism has entered mainstream culture. It is remarkable. I'm a New Yorker, so I follow New York City culture. And about every cultural institution across New York City in the last, just 6 months have enshrined Afro-futurism on their cultural agenda. This is just one example where the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the foremost art museums in the world, which contains period rooms that reflect a certain point in historical time, decided to create what amounted to an imaginary period room called Before Yesterday We Could Fly, that imagines a room in a future where African Americans are the leaders of the United States. And it is an extraordinary exhibition. But whether it's the Metropolitan Museum of Art or Carnegie Hall, all over Broadway, Afro-futurism has now become the cultural touchstone in the West. The fourth example I want to point to is very different. And let's take the next slide. This is the future utopia imagined by the libertarian right. It is the Cyber-Utopia, the Anarcho-Utopia that will be powered, can I take the next slide, by big tech. Here we have an example in the novel by David Eggers, a famous Western novelist, called The Every. The Every is a new company that he imagines will grow out of the merger of a fictitious Amazon and Google to create a kind of utopia for the United States and ultimately for the world, bringing together the power of two of the largest and most successful companies in the history of the world. This is kind of the big tech imaginary. Next slide. Much of this is based on, as they call it, Web 3.0 technology, including the support of big tech. It draws from the rise of cryptocurrencies, of non-fungible tokens, which are essentially URLs for real works of art and others that are now trading in markets. The use of blockchain technology that in its alleged randomization of all transactions can empower individuals to maintain the privacy of their transactions. And DAOs, these are decentralized autonomous organizations that in the utopian vision of big tech will become the power centers, entirely decentralized for the future political economy. And now I'll just simply wrap up so that we can have some time for discussion and questions. The next slide. We must take into account, of course, even as we imagine utopias as the source of ideas and motivation, that there are many critics of utopia as being unrealistic, susceptible to authoritarianism. After all, many totalitarian societies in the 20th century were based on original visions, whether it's Hitler's Mein Kampf or the writings of the young Stalin. These were susceptible to authoritarianism. Or is it merely escapist? How to flee a world of climate change, send your avatar into the metaverse. Next slide, please. I tend to be a bit more hopeful, and the questions that I think about are can utopia make material changes in the world? Can it make it better? Is it only about the imaginary? Does it always lead to failure or worse? Next slide. I tend to ally with the writing of Arundhati Roy, who would conclude that, yes, another world is not only possible, whether that world is utopian or not. She is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. It is with that breath that I write a book about utopia, about the education of desire, about the need to imagine new worlds. My final slide. Next. I hope I've stimulated your interest in utopia. I would welcome you to Utopia, and I hope, like me, you enjoyed this journey and you will enjoy your future journeys. And I thank you very much.